Hello, everyone. Good day. Today's lecture is all about the Philippine-American War, specifically on the question, why did Americans win the Philippine-American War? Now, most of the lessons that we will learn today are taken from Professor Glenn May's book entitled A Past Recovered, specifically on one chapter about the Philippine-American War. Now, Glenn May argued that the possession of military and economic power does not guarantee victory. So, what he meant by this is that even if an army lacks military power or lacks manpower or the logistics, and even if, say, a country being invaded also lacks economic power, it is not a guarantee that the invading forces will succeed. Although, in the case of the Philippine American War, the Americans won, although not decisively in that specific war. But Glenn May makes a very good comparison between the Philippine American War and the Vietnam War. And when we look back in retrospect during the Vietnam War, of course, the Americans lost during that war. It was at the height of the Cold War, and more or less it was what they call as proxy wars. South Vietnamese were supported by the Americans, while the North Vietnamese were supported by uh, China and even the Soviet Union. So it was a battle between capitalism and communism, which is basically how we would characterize the Cold War. So, to begin, why were the Americans interested in acquiring the Philippines? Now, according to Glenn May, there are four reasons. The first one is because of attractive commercial possibilities. The second one is because the Filipinos were incapable of ruling themselves. This was the perception of the Americans. The third one is that they were afraid of the possibility that another power would seize the islands. And then the last one, it's because of American public opinion. The Americans did not really know about the Philippines before they arrived here. Even the public did not know that much about the Philippines. Even the President William McKinley did not really know that much about the Philippines. He did not even know where the Philippines was in the map. So, for the first reason, attractive commercial possibilities, of course, this has something to do with their economic interest in the country, wherein they can possibly get raw materials for them to use, for them to export. And then, secondly, they had this benevolent intent. They called it as benevolent assimilation policy, wherein they thought that they can help the Filipino people rule themselves by educating them. According to the Americans, or for the Americans, education was imperative for the Filipinos in order for them to be capable of ruling themselves. And then the third one, there was a geopolitical concern also by the Americans, as they were afraid that another imperial nation would take over the Philippines. And of course, they had to capitalize on the chance or the possibility that the Philippines will be under them. So these were the main reasons as to why the Americans were interested in acquiring the Philippines. By and large, there were two phases of the Philippine American War. The first phase was from February to November 1899, and this phase was fought using conventional warfare. The second phase was from November until Aguinaldo's surrender, and this phase was fought using guerrilla warfare. Undeniably, US military superiority proved to have been effective. However, the Filipinos, one must note, had the numerical advantage. So now let's look at the comparison in terms of the quality of weapons used. The Filipinos used Remingtons and Mausers, while the Americans used Springfield and Krag Jorgensen. As weapons experts would say, the Filipinos had a slight advantage in terms of the weapons. Let's look at the artillery. The Americans were better off, definitely, compared to the Filipinos. They had large cannons which they utilized to their advantage, and the Filipinos were basically caught off guard with the kind of artillery that the Americans had. So the Americans were better supplied. Filipinos only had a fair amount of rifles and limited supply of bullets. So what's the use of a rifle even if we had one if we also had limited supply of bullets? It's pretty much useless. So Filipinos were poor marksmen, one must also note, whereas the Americans were trained to shoot when they were still young boys. Filipinos did not undergo any military training whatsoever. So Glenn May inferred that they were poor marksmen, whereas the Americans were trained to shoot when they were still young boys. It was a form of hobby for them. They were brought by their fathers to go hunting. So this was to the advantage of the Americans. The Americans also used a cavalry which had a shock effect to the Filipinos due to the sizes of the horses. The American horses were very big compared to the horses here in the Philippines. So it had a shock effect among the Filipinos. Some horses even trampled on the Filipinos. So another advantage of the Americans was that they controlled the sea. The Filipinos did not have a decent navy. The Americans, on the other hand, had one of the best navies in the world during this time. So this is an example of an American propaganda which showed Aguinaldo's navy during the Philippine-American War, and it's not what people would think as a powerful navy. Given that this was purportedly Aguinaldo's navy, of course it was difficult for them to defeat the Americans, and it was even more difficult to defeat them as they needed a stronger, more powerful navy, given that the Philippines is an archipelago. And if you want to defend the Philippines from foreign invaders, you definitely, of course, during his time, because there was no Air Force yet, you definitely need to have a, a strong and powerful naval force, one which Aguinaldo did not have. So, according to Glenn May, there were 10 reasons why the Americans won the Philippine American War. Sans the military factors which I have discussed a while ago, Glenn May also delineated 10 reasons. The first reason was the betrayal of the Filipino elites. Now, during the Malolos convention, the Filipino elites took part in Aguinaldo's government and became representatives in the Malolos Congress. And that was in itself a testament already that the government of Aguinaldo was going strong. But at the end of the day, those Filipino elites, when they learned about the plans of the Americans, and when they realized or became cognizant of the Americans' military superiority, they then shifted sides. Examples of elites who shifted sides were Pedro Paterno and Felipe Buencamino and others. One particular elite who did not shift sides and who became an enemy of those people who shifted sides was the very famous General Antonio Luna. And he would inevitably pay the greatest sacrifice, if not pay the price for this action, when he was assassinated not by the Americans, but by his own men, by the Filipino people themselves. So the betrayal of the Filipino elites was not surprising, to say the least. If you look at the history of these Filipino elites, they already had what I call as collaborative proclivities. What do I mean by this? Well, even during the Spanish period, these political elites or these elites clamored for not necessarily independence, but what they clamored for was a bigger role in government, that they would be recognized by the Spaniards. And some would even say that the political elites or the Filipino elites in general wanted to be recognized as Spanish citizens, wanted to be treated equally by the Spaniards. They did not necessarily want independence. Be that as it may, when the Americans came, these Filipino elites then took advantage of their position in society and sided with the Americans in the hopes of in the hopes of them being recognized by the Americans as equals, or some would even say that in the hopes of getting enough education. Aside from education, they would be given a position in government which would eventually help them maintain their power and influence over the rest of the Filipino people. And once they're given a position in government, of course, that would eventually lead to them leading the Filipino people. In reality, they really did not clamor for Philippine independence. Although some elites would say that they wanted independence, but the Filipino people were not yet ready for independence. We needed more time, we needed education. So the second reason why the Americans won is somehow connected to the first. According to Glenn May, it was the benevolent approach of the Americans. And this is what the Filipino elites wanted. They did not want violence, they did not want war to happen, they did not want a revolution because they had a lot to lose. Their businesses will suffer, and you know, they were at the losing end if they would support the Filipino people or Aguinaldo and his revolution. So, when they learned about the benevolent assimilation plan of President William McKinley, they then decided to switch sides. So, what was the benevolent approach? Well, according to William McKinley, the Americans would make the Filipinos their little brown brothers. The Americans would also educate the Filipino people. They would build schools, they would implement civic programs, they would build infrastructures, bridges, buildings. They would improve the healthcare system in the Philippines. They would provide opportunities for Filipino people to participate in government, one which they did not have a chance to do during the Spanish period, as there was limited participation of Filipinos during that time due to the racial prejudice against them and the pre existing belief among Spaniards that the Filipinos were far more inferior compared to them. So, when the Americans came to the Philippines, at first, of course, there was a war, but after the war, they made it the point to rehabilitate the colony and make themselves seem like the benevolent colonizers. so to speak. So this somehow captured the sentiments of the Filipino elites. The third reason why the Americans won was Aguinaldo's inept leadership as a military commander. By and large, although Aguinaldo was fairly successful during the Philippine Revolution of 1896, far more successful than the Supremo Andres Bonifacio. But one has to take note that Emilio Aguinaldo was not really ready to conduct and maintain a revolution for the entire Philippines. He was fairly successful in the year 1896 because he was merely in charge of Cavite. He was merely in charge of Cavite. And the Spanish forces were not centralized or were not, they did not focus much of their attention in Cavite as they focused on the capital, which is Manila. So, first factor, according to Glenn May, was Aguinaldo's initial choice of tactics. Aguinaldo decided to use the conventional form of warfare. Why conventional warfare? Because he wanted to preserve Malolos. He wanted to preserve Malolos, which was the new capital now, given that Manila was already, Intramuros or Manila was already overtaken by the Americans. Aguinaldo was not able to capture Intramuros because the Spaniards were then superseded or supplanted by the Americans. The Filipinos never had the chance to capture Intramuros. Another factor was that Aguinaldo's men lacked military training. Most of them were peasants, farmers, workers who did not have enough training uh, in the military aspect. And then another reason, according to Glenn May, was that the principal military commander was Antonio Luna, who was a pharmacist by profession. Although he was probably the best out of all the generals of Aguinaldo, one can just uh, one can just imagine the fact that one of Aguinaldo's best generals was a pharmacist by profession. I mean, it's very hard to believe that this was the case. His generals should have at least some form of military training. Luna was good in military theory, but that was not his uh, main profession. He was a pharmacist by profession. So this made it easier for. Also, Glenn May observed the relatively inept American generals. Glenn May also observed that those military generals who were sent here to the Philippines were relatively inept, but they gained a slight advantage because their counterparts were not militarily trained. The fourth reason was the lack of support from the masses. Aguinaldo was an economic elite. He was the gobernadorcillo of Kawit Cavite before. He was a member of the Principalia class. And Glenn May said that Aguinaldo was merely fighting for his class interest. So, Aguinaldo merely gained the support out of patron-client bonds. Uh, and the motive of those who supported him was that they merely wanted to serve their landlords. Probably independence was in their mind, but according to Glenn May, they were probably coerced by their landlords to fight. This is still a very debatable issue because some would say that some historians would disagree with Glenn May's statement. We'll discuss more on this during our synchronous classes. So it was virtually impossible to win without a guerrilla war and without the support of the masses. Because remember previously, in the previous reason, Aguinaldo used conventional warfare, even with the advice of his best general, General Antonio Luna, that they should fight in the mountains and start a guerrilla warfare against the Americans. Aguinaldo did not agree and opted to continue with his conventional warfare. Later on, he he acquiesced, but it was too late. It was too late to start a guerrilla war. And according to Glenn May, if ever they started a guerrilla war, they did not get the support of the masses, so it would be useless. So in his analysis, he then made a comparison between the meaning of kalayaan of Aguinaldo and Bonifacio. For Aguinaldo, to him, according to Glenn May, the meaning of kalayaan is political autonomy. He wanted independence so that he can rule over the Filipino people. He basically wanted to rule. For Bonifacio, the meaning of kalayaan was equality, it was more on brotherhood, and it was basically a social revolution to provide sort of like kaginhawaan for the people. It did not have predominantly a political motive. Bonifacio's was more on a social revolution for equality, for brotherhood. And that's why some would say that the revolution of Bonifacio is still unfinished until now because we have never achieved such a goal until now. They say that the EDSA revolution was a continuation. They say that the sporadic student protests and workers protests and peasant protests during the martial law period was a continuation of the unfinished revolution. And some would even say that until now, the unfinished revolution is still, I mean, people are still trying to continue what Bonifacio has started in 1896. The social revolution still continues. But sad to say, this will never gain, uh, it will never gain fruition if the political elites are still in power, if the political dynasties will not be abolished, if the oligarchs are still on top, of course, with the support of the military. It's very hard to dismantle that. So, those are two different meanings of kalayaan. So, Aguinaldo, according to Glenn May, merely wanted independence. So, this is the reason why he lacked the support from the masses, because the masses also wanted social change. They wanted to experience justice and they wanted to, break free from the oppression that the colonial rulers did to them and even their landlords did to them. But Aguinaldo, belonging to the economic elites, did not have much concern for this. So those are the differences. This was not the case in Vietnam, as Glenn May would say. The good thing about the essay or the article of Glenn May is that he made a juxtaposition, so to speak, between Vietnam and the Philippines. He compared the Philippine-American War and uh, the Vietnam War, Americans versus the Vietnamese. So he said that the North Vietnamese gained much of the support of the masses because of their policy of redistribution. The North Vietnamese, adhering to a socialist, some would say communist ideology, promised the redistribution of wealth and power to the people, to the masses. Tenants became landowners and were given government positions, and this benefited the peasantry. The elites were not given priority, but the tenants and the peasants, by and large, were the ones who were prioritized uh, by the North Vietnamese. So the North Vietnamese captured the sentiments of the peasantry and portrayed South Vietnam as an ally or crony of the US. So this was an ideological war now. Communism versus capitalism. The North Vietnamese, it was a proxy war. The North Vietnamese were supported by Russia and China, while the South Vietnamese were supported by the CIA, the US, and the other defenders of capitalism and, as they say, democracy. But the North Vietnamese gained much of the support of the peasantry or the masses. And again, this was because of their redistribution policy, the redistribution of wealth. The peasants were given lands, they were given food to eat, and they were prioritized over the elites. The goal for equality was uh, more or less achieved. Social change was adopted by the North Vietnamese. So there were ideological differences: liberalism versus socialism. The former defended the interest of the elites, while the latter gave much emphasis on the welfare of the lower classes. And this, and because of the uh, the focus of socialism, because of the redistribution of wealth, or the focus of socialism on the masses and the peasants, much of the masses supported the North Vietnamese and supported the ideology that is socialism. The elites, on the other hand, supported liberalism. And liberalism, admittedly, was the main ideology during Rizal's time. Rizal, some would say, was even a liberal. He was highly influenced by the ideology of liberalism, which was predominant in Europe during his time. So there were ideological differences. The next reason, according to Glenn May, is ethnic tension. Ethnic tension is synonymous to regionalism. People from Luzon, people from Visayas, people from Mindanao were not necessarily united in words and in deeds. There were some regionalistic traits that could not be extirpated. Some regionalistic traits that would cause a divide between Filipinos, especially during the revolution of Aguinaldo or the revolutionary government of Aguinaldo. Some people from Visayas did not recognize the leaders of Aguinaldo and vice versa. So there was lack of unity because of ethnic tension. The other reason, according to Glenn May, was the failure to secure foreign support. Unlike Vietnam or the North Vietnamese, who gained support from China and the USSR, the Philippines did not get any international support whatsoever. That's why the Americans had a field day here in the Philippines. The Americans, although they did not win easily, but it made their job easier because the Filipinos did not have any international or foreign support. The next reason, according to Glenn May, was geographical hindrances. As what I discussed before, the US controlled the seas, and it was impossible to coordinate with fellow revolutionaries from Visayas and Mindanao given the nature of the Navy. Aguinaldo's Navy could not match the Navy of the Americans. And because of this, it was easy for the Americans to control the seas. And since it was easy for them to control the seas, of course, it became an easy task for them to ultimately defeat the Filipino revolutionaries. The next reason, according to Glenn May, was that Filipinos had no historical tradition of warfare. Again, unlike Vietnam. The North Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese as a whole, already had a historical tradition of warfare against China. They were having sporadic, you know, skirmishes against China even before, even during the Middle Ages. And they were constantly battling against China, their neighbor in the north. But the Filipinos, although we had more or less a historical tradition of warfare during the pre-colonial period, but it was not a cohesive and a unified struggle because most of us merely focused on our barangays, and if there were wars, it was between one barangay and another. We did not have a sense of national identity yet during that time, so it was difficult for us, and we did not have this cohesive uh, historical tradition of warfare, and that was what Glenn May observed. And then the next reason, according to Glenn May, was that there were fewer restraints in the Philippines, and this simplified the task of the US. What do I mean, or what did he mean by fewer restraints? According to Glenn May, the Americans can do almost anything in the Philippines, whereas in Vietnam, the Americans were severely restrained by geopolitical pressures. You have to remember that when the Americans helped the South Vietnamese, this was during the height of the Cold War, and they cannot just do anything. They cannot just you know uh, they cannot just do anything without the pressures of other countries, without the any form of ramification from another country, which they would presumably affect. So Americans were afraid to provoke the neighboring countries of Vietnam, like Cambodia, Laos. Although they bombarded Cambodia, and uh, they faced the consequence of this uh, when the people knew. So the Americans were more restrained during the Vietnam War compared to the Philippines, or compared to the Philippine-American War. So according to Glenn May, this was even the reason why there was no invasion of North Vietnam, and they were merely defending South Vietnam from the North Vietnamese. So the last reason, according to Glenn May, or the 10th reason, according to Glenn May, was the attitude of the American public. The vast majority of the US public favored the occupation of the Philippines, even if most of them did not even know where the Philippines was in the world. They did not even know about the Philippines, but most of them, clamored to to colonize the Philippines, and maybe this was because of their uh, imperialistic desire to start a war. The last war that they faced was uh, the last big war that they faced was the U.S. Civil War, Union versus the Confederates, and then after that there were uh, skirmishes, sporadic skirmishes against the Indians. But in general, the American people were hungry for war. They were hungry to expand. They had that imperialistic desire to expand. But conversely, later on during the Vietnam War, the vast majority of the US public denounced the war. There was an anti war movement. And this was most likely because the Americans had already had enough of wars. After the Philippine-American War, or even prior to that, there was the Spanish-American War, and then concomitantly what followed was the Philippine-American War. And then later on, there was World War One. Woodrow Wilson decided to join the war in the later years. And then after World War One, there was World War Two, one which the Americans greatly uh, uh, helped the Allied forces win against the axis of evil, or as they called it, versus the Japanese and the uh, Nazis and the Italians and other allies of the Nazis. So the people had enough of wars. There was even the Korean War before the Vietnam War. So there were a lot of wars that the Americans joined. And when the time came for the Vietnam War, the American people already had enough. The public opinion was different. It was different. Plus the fact that some of them were conscripted to join the war, that exacerbated uh, the public opinion against the Vietnam War. So all these 10 reasons, according to Glenn May, made it possible for the Americans to win the Philippine-American War. The Philippine-American War, and to lose in the Vietnam War. It was a devastating loss by the Americans, the Vietnam War, one which the North Vietnamese uh, took pride in. They were very proud to have defeated uh, the uh, the American forces. So other factors, according to Glenn May, was one, there was no TV in the 1900s, so the American people did not see the ravages of war. They did not see firsthand what the Americans did to the Filipino people, the thousands of Filipinos who died during the war, who were even massacred during the war. So they did not see it. But during the Vietnam War, because of television, they were able to see the realities of war, the ravages of war. And they saw the innocent civilians, innocent Vietnamese killed by Americans themselves. And they saw poor, uh, young American boys who were conscripted to join the war die. For what? Well, it was an ideological war, a war driven by ideology, a war that was a product of uh, the Cold War. Second was there was no conscription in the 1900s. Most of the American soldiers who came to the Philippines, who were part of the expeditionary forces here in the Philippines, were enthusiastic volunteers. They wanted war. They wanted to experience war. But during the Vietnam War, most of the Americans were forced to join the war because they were conscripted, and that is the problem with conscription. So there was a difference between the two wars in terms of uh, enthusiasm in joining. So the Americans were very enthusiastic for the Philippine-American War, but for the Vietnam War, they were not because they were conscripted. And then the last factor, according to Glenn May, there were fewer college graduates in the 1900s. 27,000 college graduates compared to the 792,000 college graduates during the Vietnam War. And as they say, the more educated individuals, the more uh, they would oppose to wars because you cannot get anything from wars. You cannot get anything from wars. Although it might become uh, an instrument of uh, applying a certain political policy, but during the Vietnam War, there was a growing anti-war movement of educated individuals, college graduates who uh, who saw the reality behind the war, who saw the main reason behind the war, who saw the imperialistic agenda of America during that war. And one must admit that during the Cold War, the Americans have been supporting dictators just to combat uh, the uh, the spread of communism or socialism. There are a lot of examples. One perfect example, locally speaking, is the Americans' support for Ferdinand Marcos' dictatorship. Several American presidents supported President Marcos because even if President Marcos uh, undermined democracy, uh, the Americans saw that Marcos was the only chance for the Filipino people to fight against communism. He was the obstacle for communism to succeed in the Philippines. Thus, he was supported by the Americans. Americans even gave millions of dollars, $500 million aid, military aid to Marcos to combat communist forces, the CPP and PA. So uh, there was, this was during the height of the Cold War. So there was an ideological agenda, so to speak. And of course, the Americans would always support uh, a leader who would go against the communists during this time, as their main enemy, of course, was the USSR and to some extent China. So those are the other factors mentioned by Glenn May. So conclusion. In conclusion, the Philippine-American War was very costly. It cost the Americans around $600 million to win against the Filipino people. You have to give props to Aguinaldo for this, as he was able to delay or prolong the war, even if he knew that he would already be defeated. Now, by and large, the common denominator in the various reasons that I have discussed based on what Glenn May inferred on why the Americans won in the Philippine-American War and why they lost in the Vietnam War is, according to Glenn May, the passage of time. The Vietnamese learned from the lessons of history. They used unconventional warfare. They did not use conventional warfare. They fought against the Americans using guerrilla warfare. They took advantage of the mass support. They mobilized the masses, and this gave the Americans a very difficult time in uh, in winning the war. And during the Vietnam War, communism has already developed as an ideology. It started with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, with the rise of Vladimir Lenin and then eventually Joseph Stalin. So, with the development of communism came in development of organizational techniques, which was developed from Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution. And the other adherents of communism, like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Mao Zedong in China, were able to uh, develop their own. No, they were able to, as a result of the foundation of Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, they were inspired to fight against uh, the elites in their countries, to fight against capitalism, and eventually, uh, of course, start a socialist government, which would eventually develop to a communist one. And one must remember that the proxy wars, synonymous to the Cold War, Vietnam already had backers. The Philippines did not have any backers, did not have any foreign support. But Vietnam had the USSR and had China to support them. Although the relationship with Vietnam and China, it was more or less a love-hate relationship, so to speak. And of course, geopolitical complications. Geopolitical complications. A balance of power. The Philippines or the Filipino people, unfortunately, were not able to reach to this point in history where they were supported by an international or a foreign nation. It was the Philippine-American War was not at the height of the Cold War, where there was the so-called geopolitical complications and balance of power. Sad to say, because of the passage of time, the Filipino people uh, were defeated by the Americans, while the Vietnamese uh, were victorious against the Americans. Simply, according to Glenn May, and this is uh, a very plausible uh, analysis, simply because of the passage of time. Philippine-American War was fought in the from 1899 until the early years of the 1900s, until the surrender of Aguinaldo, while the Vietnam War was fought at the height of the Cold War in the 1960s, reaching to the early 1970s. So, because of the passage of time, because of the advantage, because of the passage of time, the Vietnamese were able to gain certain advantages. The North Vietnamese, to be specific, gained certain advantages, learned certain techniques uh, from the communist revolution in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, and they basically learned from history, learned from the lessons of history, uh, from the years of various wars and struggles. So it's a very nice conclusion. Glenn May made a very nice analysis and made a very good analysis on the reason. Aside from those 10 reasons, according to him, the main reason was the passage of time. Without the passage of time, the Vietnamese would have lost. And if the Filipinos were given this chance to learn from history, they would have possibly won. So it's a very beautiful conclusion. It's a very good analysis. So that ends our discussion for the Philippine-American War. This is a good preliminary discussion uh, for the next topics. After the Philippine-American War, then came in the civil government, the civil administration, the Taft administration, and the rest. So we will discuss that later on. I might be making other videos later on, but uh, for the rest of the topics, we will focus on synchronous discussions, synchronous classes. So I hope that you learned some important facts about the Philippine American War. And I hope that you understood the analysis of Glenn May as to why the Americans won the Philippine American War and why they lost, conversely, during the Vietnam War. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening, and I wish you well.